Welcome to Basic Brewing Radio for Thursday, March 30th, 2006. I'm James Spencer. Here at Basic Brewing Radio, we're all about home brewing. Well, this week, Gary Glass, director of the American Homebrewers Association, joins us again for a discussion that's too much. Jeff from Kenosha, Wisconsin, wrote in to ask what would happen if you went overboard in adding certain ingredients or spending too much time in certain stages of the brewing process. We put Jeff's questions to Gary to find out what he would advise. Well, I had a couple of responses to the letter from Andrew in Melbourne, Australia. If you'll remember from this past week's show, Andrew said that there's been a lot of discussion on Aussie websites about no-chill brewing, where the hot wort is left overnight to cool instead of using a chiller or an ice bath to quickly take the wort down to pitching temperature. I said I'd be afraid of contamination sneaking into the cooling wort by leaving it too long, and a couple of listeners wrote in to add their 2 cents on another aspect to watch out for in using this method. Nicholas from Aliso Viejo, California, wrote in to say, I have something to add to the overnight wort chilling debate. From my understanding, DMS, that's dimethyl sulfides, by the way, which cause a cooked vegetable off-flavor. Nicholas says DMS is created from the high temperatures of boiling, but because the pot is uncovered, it just boils off. DMS is also being created until the temperature drops enough during the chilling process, so it stands to reason that a wort left to chill overnight will have far more DMS than a wort chilled in 20 minutes. Nicholas wrote an additional follow-up email where he quoted John Palmer's online book, How to Brew. He quotes from John Palmer, DMS is continuously produced in the wort while it is hot and is usually removed by vaporization during the boil. If the wort is cooled slowly, these compounds will not be removed from the wort and will dissolve back in. Thus, it is important to not completely cover the brew pot during the boil or allow condensate to drip back into the pot from the lid. The wort should also be cooled quickly after the boil, either by immersing in an ice bath or using a wort chiller. And that's from John Palmer's online book, How to Brew. And you can find out more useful information on John Palmer's website, howtobrew.com. That's howtobrew.com. John's joined us a couple of times on the show in the past, and he's an excellent resource and, a nice guy to boot. So that's a bonus. By the way, the next edition of the printed version of How to Brew is going to be available soon, so watch out for that. Rick Sellers from Pacific Brew News Radio also weighed in with concerns about off flavors being generated. Rick says, I have judged many a beer that was clearly chilled over an extended period of time. While they may be drinkable, in quotes, there is clearly an off taste that I and other judges do not find pleasant. Wort chillers are cheap to buy from a homebrew shop and even cheaper to make at home. If you drink a beer that has been allowed to cool over a matter of hours and didn't find a problem with it, don't worry about it then. Your palate just doesn't pick up the off flavors. There are several commercial beers with similar off flavors that people enjoy readily. And Rick says sometimes it is really all about taste. However, if you are keen on beer flavors and aromas, a wort chiller is a must-have item. And Rick concludes, in fact, I recommend that it be the first item homebrewers purchase because of the added value to your beers. You might buy a brew pot first, but second, maybe, the wort chiller. So there you go. If you want to weigh in on the other side of the issue, if you've had good luck in using the no-chill method, you are welcome to chime in. Drop me a line at james@basicbrewing.com or use the contact form on basicbrewing.com. By the way, Rick recently produced an episode where he and a friend brewed a couple of batches of beer on the show, and you can check that out on pacificbrewnews.com. Matthias from Vancouver, British Columbia, wrote in last week to tell a story about a brewing blunder that he had and wondered if there were any other brewers out there who wanted to share some brewing bloopers of their own. Well, Alex in Montreal wrote in to tell a story about a brew that went horribly wrong. And I'm going to paraphrase this story here for time's sake. Alex writes, got back from the in-laws this morning. The house smelled like beer. Not really a good sign. I had brewed a batch and bottled another one on Thursday, left Friday afternoon. Thought the yeasties didn't need their herder for the weekend. The new Scotch ale seemed happy, bubbling in a cool carboy with a blow-off tube. But where's that smell coming from? Oh my God, what's that thing where the carboy used to be? Did someone put it somewhere else? Looks like it. An empty beer pack isn't where it was on Friday. But wait, this is the T-shirt that served as a carboy jacket. Why is it all wet? And where's the Scotch ale? Hey, the blow-off tube's still here. So is the wine bottle at the end of the blow-off tube. Uh-oh, there you go. That's where the smell's coming from. And that's where the carboy morphed into a pile of shattered glass in a pool of wort. Smells good, though. So Alex says, let's learn some lessons. Murphy's Law applies to brewing. Yeast can be mighty strong. A rubber stopper can stick to a carboy more strongly than the carboy's walls themselves. A blow-off tube shouldn't be constricted. There's a reason to have a headspace above fermenting wort in a primary. It's a good thing to have your fermenters in the basement. Carboys break fairly cleanly, and there are situations where beer odors don't smell so good. So, wow. In the world of bottle bombs, that one's got to be a bunker buster. You know, I'd kind of like to have heard the sound of that one going up. But that was quite a noise. Thanks to Alex for sharing his heartbreaking and carboy breaking story. Do you have a brewing blooper story that you want to share? Send it in, and I'll pass it along. Well, now I think it's time to move on to our talk this week with Gary Glass, director of the American Homebrewers Association. We asked him to give his take on what happens when you add too much of several good things to your brew. Well, Gary, welcome back again to Basic Brewing Radio.
Thanks, James.
Now, this is an interesting idea. Jeff from Kenosha, Wisconsin, wrote in to say that he has a possible suggestion for a future show. I was thinking of a show based on too much. What would happen if you put in, and then he has a laundry list of things, what would happen if you put too much of in the beer, what would happen? So I thought, while we're on the line with you talking about the National Homebrew Competition, we'll fire some questions to the director of the National Homebrew Association. So are you ready?
Yeah, sure. I'll do my best anyways.
Okay, the first on his list is too much yeast. What would happen if you put too much yeast in your beer?
Well, on a homebrew scale, it's nearly impossible to pitch too much yeast. It's much more common to have the problem of underpitching, but there are a couple of situations in which you could possibly have some ill effects from overpitching the yeast. Yeast growth has an influence on ester production. So in some styles that tend to have a lot of ester character, such as German-style Hefeweizens, which produce a lot of fruity aromas, commonly banana, pitching too much yeast you could end up with a cleaner than desired flavor profile. So you might not get nearly as much of that fruit flavor and aroma in that Hefeweizen if you pitched too much yeast. But like I said, it's pretty uncommon to overdo it in terms of the yeast. Much more common to underpitch. So I always recommend that homebrewers make a starter, make sure that there's enough nutrient in their wort, and aerate very well to get a good fermentation going.
So they probably shouldn't be worrying about putting too much yeast in there.
I think that it's really not important to worry about overpitching.
Okay. Well, too much malt or extract or all grain is his second on the list. Too much malt.
Well, that could lead to a couple of problems. First off, if there's too much malt, in more so than the recipe called for, your hop bitterness may be too low to balance the sweetness from that extra malt. And also, the more concentrated the wort, say if if the wort you collected from your all grain batch was stronger than anticipated, you had higher efficiency, or if you use too much malt extract, you end up with a more concentrated wort. You won't extract as much alpha acids out of your hops with a more concentrated wort. So there again, you're kind of compounding the issue of not having enough hops. What you could do is make a hop tea after you've gotten done with your brewing, and then add that into your fermenter to add some more bitterness.
You could just have a beer that's so high in gravity that the yeast couldn't handle it all.
Sure. Obviously, if you have too much, like a really high gravity beer or mead or whatever, the yeast might just poop out after a little while, and not be able to ferment out all the way. And so if you end up with too high a gravity, that can be a problem. And a remedy for that would be to make a starter of some champagne yeast. Make sure the starter is well aerated and has plenty of nutrient, and then you can pitch that in and hopefully finish it out.
So too much malt essentially leads to too much alcohol, which is toxic for the yeast, which is the thing that we're taking care of, the most important thing in the beer, maybe.
Right. It will depend on what type of beer you're intending to brew and what type of yeast and the health of that yeast that you pitch.
Okay. Too much specialty grains. Now, specialty grains, that's a wide category of malt out there, or grains. Mm-hmm. So I guess it would depend on which kind of grain or specialty grains that you're adding too much of, right?
Right. The ones that are the most common specialty grains would be like your crystal malts and roasted malts. There are other malts like Vienna malt or Munich malt, which you can make a beer with all Vienna or all Munich. So those aren't so much an issue, but with the highly roasted grains, such as your black patent or roasted barley, those can definitely impart some very strong flavors and should be used sparingly, even in stouts and porters that those grains are commonly used in. Too much of either black patent or roasted barley can lead to a burnt or smoky flavor. Mm-hmm. Think licking ashtray, which I've definitely gotten in judging in the past. So those grains need to be used exceptionally sparingly. Very very small amount can have a very big flavor impact. The other kinds of specialty malts that are commonly overused would be crystal malts, which can lead to sweet or syrupy beers. Crystal malt adds sugar that are unfermentable by brewer's yeast, and so they impart sweetness and body. And too much crystal malt can lead to a cloyingly sweet and often too full a bodied beer for the style that the brewer is trying for. In almost all beers, the specialty grains won't make up more than a quarter to or even less of the malt bill.
And since a lot of the specialty or most of the specialty grains or specialty malts don't have enzymes, if you don't have enough base malt, if you're making an all grain batch, if you don't have enough base malt with enough enzymes in there, you're not going to get it's not going to work out right.
Right, sure, and like with the crystal malts, they won't be fermented, since the malting process that they've gone to is created sugars that are unfermentable, and then those highly roasted grains don't have hardly any. Will have very very small contributions to fermentable sugars.
So follow the recipe.
Right, and the other a great resource on creating your own recipes would be Designing Great Beers by Ray Daniels. He goes through several different styles and uses recipes from previous national homebrew competitions to kind of give you a good idea of the different percentages of different grains that should be used in different styles.
Yeah, I tend to mention that book a lot on this show.
It's definitely one of my favorites.
Yeah, and one interesting thing that he does in the back of the book is you can really look at the history of the style and, kind of the background, and also those examples from the homebrew competitions and professional examples as well of what professionals use as far as a balance of the different grains and malts. So very interesting and useful reading.
Yeah.
Too much priming sugar. Boy, that's a dangerous one.
It certainly can be. Too much. Most often, it's not totally overdone. We see it a lot less often nowadays than several years ago. But too much priming sugar can lead to what we call gushers, or excessively carbonated beers that gush out foam when you crack the cap, and could possibly lead to explosive bottles if too much sugar is used. It's generally best to follow the standard guidelines, and those are printed in several books and online. Most commonly used would be 3/4 cup of sugar for 5 gallons of beer, or 1 1/4 cup of dried malt extract. Sticking to right around that level will give you a good amount of carbonation.
Yeah, and there have been people who have been injured by shattering bottles. So nothing. We've kind of joked about it in a couple of episodes of the show, and especially the video podcast, where we accidentally over-primed a bottle of beer. Turns out it wasn't anything to worry about, but like I say, if you think, gee, my beer wasn't carbonated enough last time I made it, I'll just double or triple the amount of priming sugar to go in there. If you're just doing that blind, you're asking for trouble, I think.
Yeah, certainly. Definitely you need to follow the guidelines, because it can be dangerous if you overprime.
Too much water.
Too much water will, it leads to thin and watery beer. If you're doing a full wort boil and you collect too much runoff from, say, an all-grain batch, what you can do is increase your boil time and boil off some of that excess water, and get down to the level that you were intended. Or you could add concentrated. You could make, if it's too late and your beer's already in the fermenter and you think it's too watery, you could make up some malt extract and do a concentrated wort to boost your original gravity. But generally, just going to lead to a thin and watery beer.
Okay, the next one on the list is too much adjuncts.
That's kind of similar to using too much water.
I guess it depends on what is defined as adjuncts. Whether that's additional things to add to get you more fermentable sugars, that would be one thing, I guess.
Sure, like if you're using adjuncts like corn or rice, those are used by the major brewers to produce beers that have a certain level of alcohol, but without the flavor that's imparted by malted barley. The other issue that you're going to run into is, like you were saying with the specialty grains, is those adjuncts don't contribute to any enzymes that will convert starches to sugar. So if you have too much of those adjuncts, then you won't be able to convert all your starches, and those starches will be carried over into the beer, and they can lead to fermentation issues. They can lead to problems if there's any kind of bacteria in there. They'll be able to ferment those starches. It also can lead to haziness in the finished product.
So again, follow the recipe. This next one is probably something that many have tried out there nowadays. Too much hops. He says, Jeff says, is there such a thing? Does the bitterness top out? And that is actually kind of a scientific question. Can you top out the bitterness?
Well, from what I understand, there is a limit to the amount of bitterness that people can perceive. And if I recall correctly, that perception of bitterness tops out somewhere a little over 80 IBUs. Guessing, and I know I've heard this a few years ago, but that's what my recollection is. But there's definitely a limit to what people can perceive in terms of bitterness. But that's not to say that adding more bittering hops won't influence the character of the beer. And certainly, depending on what kind of bittering hops you're using, you can, if you're using 100 IBUs of Chinook hops for bittering, you'll end up with a much different beer than if you were using 100 IBUs of say Magnum hops. Those Chinook hops, your boiling hops are generally going to give you bitterness, but they do impart some character to the finished beer other than just that bitterness, as well as the type of bitterness. Chinooks are kind of known for being a little rough, but they also add kind of a piney, resiny character, whereas Magnum hops tend to be much more neutral and a softer bitterness.
And when we were talking to Ray Daniels, he was saying that since IBU, or the International Bitterness Units, since that is a measurement of the ratio of the bitterness compounds in a certain volume, he was saying that there is a limit in that, it's kind of like putting sugar in lemonade. There's only so much sugar that will go into the solution of the lemonade, and after a while, the rest of it is just going to fall out. Mm-hmm. So he was saying that, I think he was saying around 100 IBUs is kind of like the limit for the amount of bitterness that you can actually put into a beer or a certain volume. But, when going back to, and Ray talks about this a lot too, the bitterness to gravity ratio. If you were talking about if you put too much malt, either in extract or in all grain, you're going to get too syrupy or too sweet a beer. If you put too much hops in ratio to the amount of sweetness or malt that you put in there, you're going to get a beer that's not balanced and is not as good as it could be, right? Sure,
absolutely. And I think that's, especially like with judging of beers, one of those big things that comes up is the balance. And certain styles call for the balance to be one way or the other, but there should be some level of balance between sweetness and bitterness.
Now, some may prefer that the scale be tipped a little more in one way or the other. But, a lot of these beers that have a lot of IBUs also are very high in gravity, and have a lot of alcohol as well to, kind of, they've had a lot of malt in there to kind of balance that out.
Right, sure. You wouldn't want to use 100 IBUs of hops in a light lager.
No. You might try it once.
Yeah, you might get near it, but probably one sniff of it, you might not want to take a sip.
Well, the next on the list is too much time in the primary fermenter.
The biggest problem with too much time in the primary fermenter is going to be the exposure of your fermenting beer to the trub and the yeast. As the yeast drops out, it'll collect at the bottom, and over time it'll start to break down, and that process is called autolysis, and it leads to flavors that are often described as rubbery. I generally perceive them as being kind of a meaty flavor, like as in bologna that's going bad.
Yeesh.
It's quite unpleasant. And you can also get with exposure to the trub that's left on the bottom, you can get problems with clarity. It can lead to hazes and stability issues. So it's always a good thing to get it off the yeast before too long. But then again, you don't want to take it off too early. If it's still fermenting vigorously, you might lose some of that yeast that would later take up some of the off flavors that can develop, like diacetyl.
I asked Dave Logston of Y Yeast, how much time is too much time on the primary yeast cake, and he said about 14 days is a good rule of thumb to keep it on the primary yeast. So that's what I've been going with, and I
would agree with that. I mean, I've certainly through circumstances had beers that sat on the primary yeast for 2 weeks or more on some occasions, and they came out all right. But I would say that once you hit that 2 week level, you're definitely pushing it.
Now there's on a similar and maybe a similar answer, too much time in the secondary fermenter.
Too much time in the secondary fermenter is usually it's not nearly the problem that you have with the primary fermenter. But eventually, like all beers are gonna stale, and the longer it sits there, once it's hit its prime, the more you're going to start picking up oxidation. If you dry hopped your beer in the secondary, you can start getting off flavors from having the beer sit on those hops too long. Get kind of a vegetal or grassy character that comes off of those hops, and you can eventually get autolysis, although it's not nearly as likely as with the primary fermenter.
And I guess the last one, and probably a similar answer, again, too much time in the bottle, although, I don't seem to have that trouble.
Neither do I, but it really depends on the beer. Different styles can hold up for different lengths of time, and also really depends on how well the beer has been handled. If it's been splashed around too much, it might have picked up too much oxidation. It'll start going bad faster. But generally, lighter styles won't stand up to oxidation and staling as long as stronger beers. In some styles, like old ales and barley wines, the oxidation can actually lead to positive flavors. You can get the sherry flavors that you get in some English old ales would be an example of that. Strong beers generally can stay in the bottles for up to several years. I've had beers that were more than 10 years old that were fantastic.
Wow.
But then again, some of those lighter beers won't be doing so great after 6 months as they were after 3 months.
So to be safe, drink as much as possible, as quickly as possible. Except for those heavy beers.
Almost all beers are best fresh. It's really only those strong beers that it's worth having them sit around and age. Otherwise, definitely fresher beer is better beer.
Yeah. Now, a lot of times people, they email me and well, there's something wrong with my beer, and they haven't been homebrewing long, and I say, well, just be patient. It may work itself out. These things that you're perceiving as off flavors, the yeast may take care of in the bottle, and everything may just be just okay here in a couple months. And more often than not, I get responses saying, thank you for for telling me to wait. That these things work out. But I guess if you go too long, you're going to go past that point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I would agree with what you're saying. Oftentimes I've had that in my own beers where they just taste a little rough to start with, but after a few weeks or a month or two, they definitely smooth out and are better than they were. But there's always going to be that point in which they're not going to get any better, and that point, you might as well drink it.
Well, good advice. Well, Gary, I hope that we haven't taken too much of your time.
Not at all. It's been my pleasure.
Well, excellent. We'll have to do this again or something similar.
Sure, anytime.
Well, thanks again to Gary Glass, Director of the American Homebrewers Association. Now, I want to remind you that the National Homebrewers Conference is coming up June 22nd through 24th in Orlando, Florida. I've looked at the schedule online, and it looks like quite an event. You can go to beertown.org, the Brewers Association site, to find out more. If you have brewing questions, show suggestions, or just want to say hey, write to james@basicbrewing.com, or just fill out the contact form on basicbrewing.com. And please don't forget to tell us where you're from. And while you're on our site, you can check out our new online shop where you can find new pricing on our DVDs and a combo deal to save you even more. In Basic Brewing Introduction to Extract Home Brewing, we walk you through the extract brewing process step by step from boiling to bottling. And in Basic Brewing Stepping into All Grain, we take you through the all grain process from milling your grain to collecting your wort. You can see a listing of the fine folks across the country who sell our DVDs on basicbrewing.com, and if there isn't a vendor in your area, you can order it online. And if your local homebrew store doesn't carry our DVDs, maybe you can suggest that they can contact me to find out how. And please support your local homebrew store. That's all until next week. Until then, thanks for listening. I'm James Spencer. Production help for Basic Brewing Radio and our website is provided by Kelly Dodson. Basic Brewing Radio is a production of Active Voicing. We'll talk to you next time. So long.